They say the world's oldest profession is something else entirely, but in truth, it may well be spying. Long before satellites, before wiretaps, before encrypted codes hummed across the airwaves, human beings were already whispering secrets in the dark, secrets stolen, traded, and betrayed, because information has always been more valuable than gold and deadlier than any weapon. Imagine it, the dawn of civilization, great empires rising in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China. While kings and generals paraded in the sunlight, their power often rested not on armies or monuments, but on the shadows cast just beyond the torchlight. In those shadows moved the spies, men and women disguised as merchants, servants, envoys, even lovers. They carried with them not swords, but stories, knowledge of enemy troop movements, of grain shortages, of whispers of revolt. A single scrap of truth could topple a throne, and in those earliest days, rulers understood something that remains true even now. To control the future, you must first control information. Spying is not just about deception, it's about anticipation. Who will strike first? Who can be trusted? Who plots in silence, waiting for the right moment to betray? From the moment humans organized themselves into tribes and states, the need to know what lay beyond the horizon became a matter of survival. And so, across thousands of years, espionage evolved. From clay tablets carrying coded messages in the deserts of Babylon, to assassins lurking in the streets of Rome, to invisible inks scribbled on parchment in Renaissance courts. Each age refined the tools, but the game remained the same. There is a strange paradox at the heart of espionage. History celebrates kings and conquerors, yet often the true architects of victory never appear in the record books. Their names erased, their deeds hidden, their shadows stretched across history, only glimpsed when a secret slips, when a betrayal comes to light. But if we pull on those threads, the story begins to unravel. We find that espionage has shaped not just battles but entire civilizations. It is the hidden current beneath the tides of history, flowing unseen but always pulling. The story you're about to hear is not a tale of glory. It is not the kind of history written in marble or carved into stone. It is a story of silence, of disguises, of betrayals whispered in candlelit rooms. It is the history of the spy. From ancient pharaohs to Cold War double agents, from the shadows of medieval castles to the glowing screens of our digital age, spies have shaped the fate of nations, toppled empires, and altered the course of humanity, all while remaining invisible. So let us step into that world together, the world behind the curtain, the story behind the story. This is not the history you read in textbooks. This is a history lived in the shadows, a history of secrets, a history of lies, a history of spying. The first spies were not cloaked in trench coats or armed with gadgets. They were often ordinary people, blending into the rhythms of daily life. Merchants with carts of goods, travelers wandering strange roads, envoys carrying gifts to foreign courts. But hidden beneath their cloaks and smiles, they carried something far more valuable: information. To the ancient world, espionage was not a luxury, it was survival. In the land of the pharaohs, where temples touched the sky and armies marched across burning deserts, information was a weapon wielded with precision. Egyptian rulers maintained networks of informants who traveled with merchants and caravans, listening, watching, reporting back. During the reign of Ramses II, spies were used to track the movements of the Hittite Empire. Before the Great Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, Egyptian scouts captured two enemy spies who, under interrogation, revealed the Hittite army's plans. This intelligence changed the way Ramses deployed his forces, and though the battle itself ended in a stalemate, it showed that even in the age of chariots and bronze swords, the outcome of war could hinge on the whispers of spies. Far to the east, in ancient China, espionage reached new heights of sophistication. No text embodies this more than The Art of War, written by Sun Tzu over 2,500 years ago. Know the enemy and know yourself, he wrote, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. But how does one truly know the enemy? Through spies. Sun Tzu classified them into 5 distinct categories: local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies. Each served a different purpose, from infiltrating enemy ranks to feeding false information, from turning enemy agents into double agents, to using sacrificial spies whose deaths concealed greater secrets. To Sun Tzu, spies were not expendable pawns. They were the very foundation of strategy. Armies could be rebuilt, fortresses repaired, weapons reforged, but once secrets slipped away, they could not be reclaimed. In India, around the 4th century BC, espionage became state policy under Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire. His advisor, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, authored the Arthashastra, a political manual as ruthless as it was brilliant. Within its pages lay entire chapters on espionage. Spies were disguised as ascetics, merchants, prostitutes, and even wandering holy men. Their task was to gather intelligence, spread disinformation, and ensure loyalty within the empire. Suspicion was not a crime in the Mauryan state. It was the fuel that kept the empire secure. Chanakya understood a timeless truth: power is fragile, and loyalty often hangs by a thread. To maintain control, a ruler needed eyes and ears everywhere. Across the Mediterranean, in the bustling city-states of Greece, espionage played a quieter but no less vital role. Athens prided itself on democracy and debate, but in times of war, shadows grew long. During the Peloponnesian War, spies moved between Athens and Sparta, slipping through enemy lines disguised as traders or citizens. Greek generals relied on informants to report troop movements, supply shortages, and political intrigue. And though their gods looked down from marble temples, the fate of Greece often rested on men who vanished into the night with stolen knowledge. But it was Rome that elevated espionage into a tool of empire. In its earliest days, Rome used scouts and informants to protect its borders. But as the Republic expanded, and later, as the empire grew vast and unwieldy, intelligence became the lifeblood of control. Julius Caesar himself relied heavily on networks of informants during his campaigns in Gaul, using coded messages delivered on strips of parchment hidden in wax tablets. A single letter could be the difference between victory and annihilation. Later, under the emperors, the need for intelligence turned inward. With plots and conspiracies ever brewing in the Senate and among the legions, Roman rulers employed a secret service known as the frumentari. Officially, they were grain supply officers. In reality, they became imperial spies, monitoring generals, senators, and even ordinary citizens for signs of disloyalty. Fear of betrayal seeped into the very marrow of Roman politics, for in Rome, daggers were often hidden behind smiles, and the most dangerous enemy was not always across the frontier, but seated beside you at the banquet table. Across these ancient civilizations, Egypt, China, India, Greece, Rome, the methods varied, but the truth remained constant. Information was power. Armies could clash, kings could rise and fall, but behind every visible struggle lay an invisible war of spies. They wore no uniforms. They fought in no grand battles. Their victories were rarely sung in poetry or etched into monuments, yet their work often decided who lived, who died, and who ruled. And so, by the time the ancient world gave way to the Middle Ages, espionage had already become inseparable from politics, warfare, and survival itself. The torch of secrecy was lit in the temples of Egypt, refined in the courts of China, sharpened in the palaces of India, whispered through the streets of Athens, and wielded with ruthless precision in Rome. When the ancient world crumbled, that torch did not go out. It passed quietly into the hands of kings, popes, and warlords who would shape the dark centuries that followed. The Roman Empire had fallen, but the world did not suddenly grow quieter. It grew darker. Castles rose where marble temples once stood. Kings ruled not with the might of vast empires, but with fragile alliances and iron fists. And while armies still clashed on open fields, the most decisive battles often unfolded in whispers, in candlelit chambers, and in the minds of spies. This was the Middle Ages, an age of knights and crusades, of kings and popes. but also an age where information could kill just as surely as a sword. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, its eastern half, Byzantium, endured, and in Constantinople, espionage was an art form. Byzantine emperors relied heavily on secret agents to maintain their grip on power. Envoys disguised as merchants prowled foreign courts, reporting on alliances, betrayals, and rumors. Others carried gold and promises, bribing enemies into submission before a single arrow was loosed. Their most feared weapon, however, was not a sword or a fleet. It was intelligence. With it, Byzantium survived invasions, rebellions, and endless plots hatched within the gilded halls of its own palace. One chronicler wrote that the Byzantines trusted spies more than soldiers. Soldiers might win battles, but spies prevented wars. As Christianity spread across Europe, the church became a power rivaling kings, and with that power came its own intelligence network. Monks and priests doubled as informants, sending word of heresies, uprisings, or threats to papal authority. Pilgrimages and missions, cloaked in faith, often concealed more earthly purposes. A man traveling to a holy site might also be tasked with observing fortifications, gauging loyalties, or sowing discord among rivals. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had woven secrecy into the very fabric of power. And with the founding of the Inquisition, the line between spiritual guardianship and political espionage blurred into shadow. In 1096, the First Crusade was launched. Knights from across Europe took up the cross, marching east to reclaim the Holy Land. But beneath the banners of faith, espionage quietly shaped the battlefield. Spies and scouts were dispatched across the Middle East, gathering intelligence on routes, supplies, and enemy movements. Arabic chronicles tell us that Muslim leaders also relied heavily on informants, some of them former crusaders turned traitors. Perhaps the most mysterious of all were the assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, a secretive sect that struck terror into the hearts of rulers across the region. Hidden in mountain fortresses, their agents carried out political killings with surgical precision. To their enemies, they seemed unstoppable, ghosts that slipped through walls and left kings bleeding in their beds. Back in Europe, espionage became inseparable from the ambitions of kings and queens. In England, the Norman kings built networks of informants to suppress rebellion and monitor rivals. Their scribes recorded taxes and loyalties with chilling precision, turning parchment into a weapon as sharp as any spear. Centuries later, in the courts of France and England, spies became fixtures in the endless rivalry of monarchs. Royal marriages were not just political alliances. They were opportunities for infiltration. A foreign queen might arrive with jewels, servants, and spies hidden among them. And at every coronation, at every feast, there was always the suspicion, who here was truly loyal, and who carried messages in the folds of their robes. Farther east, the Mongol Empire expanded at a pace the world had never seen, but they did not rely on brute force alone. Before the hoofbeats of their horses thundered across a land, Mongol scouts and spies had already mapped its rivers, measured its walls, and gauged its defenses. The Mongols used merchants and travelers as their eyes, embedding them deep within enemy territory long before an invasion. And when their armies finally arrived, they often knew more about their enemies' lands than the people who lived there. It was not just ferocity that built their empire. It was foresight, the intelligence gathered in silence before the storm. The Middle Ages were defined by faith, feudalism, and war, but beneath all of it ran an invisible current of secrecy. Byzantine emperors who held power through deception, popes who guided policy with whispers, kings who built webs of informants to hold their thrones, assassins who turned fear itself into a weapon, Mongols who conquered not just with armies, but with knowledge gathered long before the first arrow flew. The knight in shining armor may be the symbol of the Middle Ages, but behind him stood another figure, unseen, the spy, the shadow, the listener at the door. And as Europe stumbled out of the medieval world and into the Renaissance, espionage did not vanish. It grew sharper, more dangerous, more professional. Because in a world of rising kingdoms, shifting faith, and fragile empires, secrecy was not just survival, it was destiny. The Middle Ages faded, and Europe awoke to something new. The Renaissance, an age of rediscovery, invention, and ambition. Art flourished, science advanced, but as kingdoms grew wealthier and more powerful, so too did their hunger for secrets. The spy was no longer a shadow at the edge of power. He was now its constant companion. Nowhere was this more true than in Italy. In Florence, Venice, and Milan, power was a fragile balancing act. One betrayal, one alliance, one dagger away from collapse. Venice, perched on its lagoon, became a master of secrecy. The Venetian Republic built what some historians call the first true intelligence agency. Behind its elegant palaces, the Council of Ten maintained a vast web of informants and spies. Citizens were even encouraged to submit anonymous accusations through carved stone mouths in public walls, the Bocche di Leone, the lion's mouths. This climate of suspicion turned Venice into a city where loyalty was currency, and betrayal a death sentence. It was no accident that Venice survived centuries surrounded by enemies. Its greatest offense was not its fleet, but its secrets. The Renaissance also gave birth to something new, the professional diplomat. In earlier centuries, kings sent envoys only for special occasions, to arrange marriages, negotiate truces, or demand tribute. But in the 15th century, Italian city-states pioneered the idea of permanent embassies. Ambassadors lived in foreign courts, their task not just to negotiate, but to observe every gesture, every rumor, every flicker of dissent. Their letters home became treasure troves of intelligence. And though ambassadors were granted immunity by custom, everyone understood. They were spies in all but name. It was in this charged atmosphere that Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat, wrote The Prince. Though remembered as a handbook for ruthless rulers, it was also a reflection of the espionage-soaked politics of his time. Machiavelli argued that rulers must be cunning as foxes, ruthless as lions. He praised deception, trickery, and manipulation as tools of survival. The end, he wrote, justifies the means. And in the courts of Europe, spies became the sharpest of those means. Even the church was not immune. In Rome, the papacy transformed into both a spiritual and political power, and with it came the Vatican's own intelligence networks. Popes used spies to monitor rival cardinals, intercept correspondence, and influence the endless chess game of European politics. A papal envoy might bless a monarch in public while secretly undermining him in private. It was said that Rome was the city where no letter was safe, no alliance secret for long. Faith was preached from the pulpits, but politics was whispered in the shadows of the Sistine Chapel. The Renaissance had armed rulers with a new weapon, organized, professional intelligence. But the 17th and 18th centuries would hurl espionage onto a stage far larger than ever before. Europe was no longer just a continent of rival city-states. It was the heart of empires. And empires meant distance, oceans, colonies, trade routes stretching like veins across the world. To rule them, kings and queens needed not just soldiers and ships, but secrets. The Dutch Republic was small, fragile, a sliver of land reclaimed from the sea. Yet in the 17th century, it built a maritime empire that spanned from the East Indies to the Caribbean. How? Not by brute force alone, but by information. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became as much an intelligence agency as a trading corporation. Its ships carried not just spices and silk, but maps, charts, and intercepted letters. Captains were ordered to keep journals on foreign harbors, rival fleets, even the mood of local rulers. Merchants became spies, spies became merchants, and in Amsterdam, the stock exchange itself buzzed with rumors and coded signals. In the Dutch Golden Age, money and intelligence were inseparable. In France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, built a state that glittered with power. Versailles dazzled with mirrors and gold, but beneath the splendor lay a machinery of surveillance. Louis employed an army of informants and letter interceptors. His police chief, Gabriel de la Reynie, pioneered the Cabinet Noir, the Black Chamber. Here, trained clerks slid open letters, copied their secrets, and resealed them without a trace. It was said that no lover's note, no whispered plot, no plea for mercy could pass through France without being read by the king's men. And while the Sun King shone bright, His spies worked in the shadows, ensuring no intrigue could eclipse him. Across the Channel, Britain was facing a different challenge, the constant threat of civil war and foreign intrigue. After the glorious revolution of 1688, James II, the deposed Catholic king, fled into exile. But his followers, the Jacobites, plotted endlessly to restore his line to the throne. For decades, Jacobite conspiracies simmered. Some were amateur, born in taverns and whispered in corners. Others were deadly serious, backed by France, Spain, or the Vatican. British intelligence worked tirelessly to infiltrate these plots. Double agents lured conspirators into traps. Messages hidden in shoes and cider barrels were intercepted. Time and again, schemes unraveled before they could ignite. It was an early lesson for Britain that its greatest threats might not march openly with banners and drums, but creep quietly with letters and oaths of loyalty. And then, across the Atlantic, espionage found a new home. When the American colonies rose against Britain in 1775, muskets and cannons alone could not secure independence. Washington's army was outnumbered, outgunned, and poorly supplied. To survive, it needed intelligence. Thus was born the Culper Ring, a network of farmers, merchants, and patriots who funneled information from British-occupied New York straight to Washington's desk. They used invisible ink, coded ciphers, and dead drops hidden in barrels and fields. They moved silently, at great personal risk. Some were captured, some were hanged, but their work helped turn the tide. In the struggle for American independence, the spy proved as vital as the soldier. By the dawn of the 19th century, one man towered over Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. A general, a statesman, an emperor, and a master of intelligence. Napoleon used espionage not just to learn the enemy's movements, but to shape their perceptions. He fed false reports, spread rumors, and planted misinformation. To him, deception was as potent as artillery. His minister of police, Joseph Fouché, was perhaps the most feared spymaster of the age. Ruthless, calculating, he wove a net of surveillance so tight that conspirators barely had time to breathe. Fouché knew not just what Napoleon's enemies planned, but what Napoleon himself was thinking. Some whispered that Fouché held the true power of France in his dossiers, and in many ways, he did. By the close of the 18th century, espionage had expanded beyond palaces and city squares. It was now global. In the colonies of Asia, Africa, and the Americas, spies tracked trade routes, native alliances, and rival empires. Naval intelligence became a profession unto itself. Cryptography advanced, with mathematicians racing to invent codes that could withstand interception. Spying had become not just a tool of kings, but an arm of empire. And as empires collided, espionage would grow only sharper, more ruthless, more necessary. The age of empire had made the spy indispensable, but the 19th century was already stirring with new forces: steam engines, telegraphs, railways, industrial armies. And with them came new dangers, new opportunities, new shadows to hide in. The spy was no longer merely the servant of a prince or a pope. He was becoming a permanent figure in the machinery of the modern state. The world was about to enter an age where technology and espionage would march side by side into battlefields more destructive than anything humanity had ever known. The 19th century dawned with smoke and iron. Steamships carved the oceans, railroads stitched continents, telegraph wires pulsed with dots and dashes that carried news faster than any horse could ride. The world was shrinking, and in that shrinking world, secrets became more dangerous than ever. For centuries, espionage had been the craft of priests, merchants, and adventurers, but now nations began to institutionalize it. Britain's admiralty developed permanent intelligence offices to monitor the movements of rival navies. Russia's Okhrana hunted revolutionaries across Europe with a network of agents and informers. Prussia, later Germany, organized one of the first true military intelligence bureaus, tracking enemies with bureaucratic precision. The spy was no longer just a shadow, he was becoming a profession. Technology didn't just shrink the globe, it rewired espionage itself. The telegraph allowed armies and governments to move information at lightning speed, but also opened a new front for interception and code breaking. Railways meant faster troop movements, so intelligence on timetables and logistics could mean the difference between victory and disaster. And then came photography. With a single lens, a spy could capture the layout of a fortress or the blueprint of a new weapon in seconds, proof more reliable than memory or rumor. The shadows had new tools. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in Central Asia, where Britain and Russia played what came to be called the Great Game. Here, amid deserts, mountains, and ancient caravan routes, agents in disguise mapped rivers, posed as pilgrims, and bribed local chieftains. Each side feared the other would gain control of India, the jewel of empire. The men who ventured into this wilderness were part diplomat, part soldier, part spy. They carried not just pistols, but notebooks, measuring altitudes, sketching fortresses, noting the loyalties of tribes. It was espionage on a continental scale. The clash of empires fought not just with armies, but with maps and whispers. But even as empires dueled, a different threat emerged: revolution. In Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, radicals plotted the overthrow of kings and tsars. Anarchists moved through Europe with bombs in briefcases. Secret societies communicated with passwords, handshakes, and coded pamphlets. Governments responded with secret police. Files swelled. Informers wormed their way into meetings and bedrooms. Trust grew scarce. In this war between order and rebellion, espionage was not just a shield, it was a weapon. One that could imprison, exile, or eliminate an enemy before the first shot was fired. From clay tablets in Mesopotamia to coded telegrams racing down copper wires, the story of espionage had followed the story of civilization itself. Every empire, every rebellion, every king and council, all had leaned on spies to survive. Because power is not just about what you can build or what you can command. It's about what you know and what you can keep hidden. As the 20th century loomed, with machine guns, battleships, and the whisper of flight in the skies, espionage stood ready to step out of the shadows and into the furnace of global war. The great conflicts of the modern age would not just be fought in trenches and cities. They would be fought in safe houses, in code books, in the silent spaces between truth and deception. The spy has always lived in that space, between truth and fear. From temples in Babylon to cloisters in medieval courts, to the smoke-filled offices of modern capitals, they are the watchers, the deceivers, the invisible hands that shift the fate of nations. And though the tools have changed, from whispers to wires, from ciphers to satellites, the essence remains the same. The war in the shadows never ends. Because as long as there is power to be won, there will be secrets to be stolen. And that, like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, is history's reminder that the past is never truly past. It lingers, written in shadows, waiting to be read.